This is Charlie Cahoon, Extension Weed Specialist at North Carolina State University. Today I'm going to be covering doveweed management in the Blacklands. Doveweed, also known as marsh dayflower, is a summer annual weed in the dayflower family. Doveweed prefers wet, poorly drained areas, and that's why we had more calls this year about doveweed control in the Blacklands because of the wet conditions we had in May and June. The weed also emerges late in the season, typically in June, which is much later than many of our other weeds. And then the main reasons it's particularly troublesome is because glyphosate is weak on doveweed. Right now, doveweed is scattered throughout the Blacklands and it's starting to move west. Here's some work that highlights the poor activity on doveweed from glyphosate. This is looking at doveweed control 10 days after treatment and 28 days after treatment from a trial done in Hyde County by Dr. York in 1998. If we look at doveweed control 10 days after treatment, we only have about 73% control by glyphosate, and that control drops to just over 50% by glyphosate at 28 days after treatment. Compare that to paraquat or gramoxone, which controlled doveweed 100% 10 days after treatment and was hovering around 80% at 28 days after treatment. So this just shows us if we're going to go after doveweed burn down, we're going to have to be using a product like paraquat instead of glyphosate. Moving on to doveweed control options in corn. This is looking at doveweed control 10 days after treatment and 28 days after treatment. Roundup less than 20% control 10 days after treatment, no control at 28 days after treatment. And that's comparable to the ALS materials, dicamba, and also 2,4-D. So poor control with all of those materials. Now, options that did give us decent control, atrazine gave us around 80% control 28 days after treatment. Evic, surprisingly, which is a cousin to atrazine, when it was applied with drop nozzles, gave us 97% control 28 days after treatment. And then Liberty, about 70% control 28 days after treatment, so much better than Roundup. Not where we would like to see control at 80% or above, but it could be an option in multiple applications to kind of beat that doveweed back. Although we do have some post-emergence options for controlling doveweed in corn in atrazine, Evic, and to some degree Liberty, management is a little more complicated than that. Like I mentioned previously, doveweed emerges late in the season. Actually, optimum temperature for germination occurs at 77 to 89 degrees Fahrenheit. And we don't typically see those soil temperatures in the Blacklands until around the end of May, early June. And this is well after corn planting and a lot of times well after our post-emergence applications have gone on. So how do we attack doveweed in corn? It's important to remember that doveweed emerges late in the season. So anything that we can do to facilitate early canopy closure will help us deal with that late season doveweed in corn. It's also critical to start the season clean. If you have any doveweed emerged at planting, you need to take it out with paraquat instead of something like glyphosate. And then we need to stay clean throughout the season, relying on atrazine post or Evic post-directed or with drop nozzles. And if you have the option to use Liberty, multiple applications of Liberty will likely do a decent job, although not as good as atrazine or Evic. Now again, the big problem is most of the doveweed is going to emerge after our post-timing in corn. So that means we need something with some residual. Thankfully, one of the families that works in the Blacklands is the group 15s, and they do have activity, residual activity against doveweed. So the things like dual magnum, outlook, and warrant would be something that you could put in your post application that would give you some residual activity against doveweed and keep that crop clean further into the season. Now, how about doveweed management in cotton? So we're planting cotton much later than corn, so there may be some doveweed that's actually emerged when we're planting some cotton. So it's important, if you have emerged doveweed, to use paraquat instead of glyphosate around planting. Thankfully, we have a group 15 in the form of warrant that can be used pre-emergence on cotton, so that would be a good option in combination with paraquat for some early season residual control of doveweed. And then it's important to stay clean and stay ahead of that doveweed emergence with the post residuals, dual magnum, outlook, and warrant. Again, they have residual activity against doveweed, but they will not control it post emergence. So you have to get it on before that doveweed emerges. Now, a lot of folks ask about first rate, post directed, or lay-by, and that is not currently labeled for cotton. Dr. York did do a lot of research in support of this application. However, it was never labeled. Well, some things change as the industry does, and now AMVAC has acquired first rate from Corteva. So I've actually reached out to AMVAC and trying to see if there's any interest in being able to get first rate labeled for that lay-by or post-directed application in cotton. And that would give us a good option for controlling that emerged doveweed late in the season, because the things like 2,4-D, dicamba, Roundup are not very good on doveweed that is emerged, and Liberty is kind of moderate at best. From an integrated standpoint, it's important to look at what we can do for doveweed control in our rotational crops. And one of my first recommendations to growers that have difficulty with doveweed is to rotate to soybeans. First rate is labeled for soybeans and is very effective for doveweed management. So that would be a way to get out ahead of that doveweed population. It's also important to make sure you control all doveweed before you plant, and then also after harvest. Again, because it comes up late in the season, you may not notice you have it until you actually harvest that crop. If you do have some emerged after you harvest that crop, like corn, it would be important to take that out so you don't have as much to deal with in the next season.